Why don't we get started now? And thank you, everyone, for coming to this evening webinar to talk about the study on welcoming immigrants to Washington. I really absolutely fantastic that we've been able to have this published already and available on Amazon at a very low cost in both the hard copy and the Kindle version on it. So you'll hear a little bit more later about how to get into the study information, but we're just delighted that we have this opportunity. So I'm Susan Martin. I'm the chair of the study committee on welcoming immigrants to Washington State. We'll get yep, there we go. On that. So why don't you go to the first slide, Lydia? So I want to start by thanking people, and I won't go through all of these names, but we've had a fantastic study committee. We've worked really well together to come up with what I think is a very, very good report on this issue. Lydia Zbita and I are the co-authors of the study, and I want to give a particular thanks to the members of the reading committee and the technical reading committee, who also whose names are there, because they gave us really, really good feedback. And of course, the greatest thanks go to all of the people we interviewed for this study, because without their knowledge and commitment and passion, really, for the issues, I don't think we'd have come up with nearly as much good information as we did. Lydia. The presentation is in basically 3 parts to it. We're going to start with the study highlights and tell you a little bit more about the research that we did for the study. And then we're going to go to 2 related things, the consensus questions and the consensus process. In between these 2 parts of the evening, we're going to break for a time to answer any questions that people may have about the study findings or of how we did the study or things of that sort. And then again, after the consensus process and facilitation, we'll go on with another Q&A. So quickly, the immigration study was proposed in 2023. It was approved in 2024 in terms of the very specifics of the study. And we spent some time on developing our way of handling the data and all of that stuff. The discussion and consensus questions were adopted in January, and we were able to then move through in terms of getting this webinar going. And that the important thing to take away from this, though, is that the consensus meetings on this particular study are to be held between now and about March 24th, because we need to have your responses to the consensus questions no later than March 28th in order to get the position finalized and approved by the board before the convention in June. So we have a tight timeline for doing it, and we really hope that you're able to do the consensus by the end of March so that we can get all of this information. Lydia? Okay. Part of the interest we had in doing this study, and the reason we call it Welcoming Immigrants to Washington, is because the state made a commitment many years ago to be a welcoming state. In fact, the governor in the 1970s was very, very committed to the admission of refugees into Washington state, and was the first to actually use the language of "we're a welcoming state" on that. More recently, there was an executive order first by Governor Inslee that said that we remain a welcoming jurisdiction and believed in diversity, had compassion, tolerance, and recognized the contributions, the value of immigrants. And then the legislature passed a very similar statement that said that there's a substantial and compelling interest in ensuring that Washington remains a place where, and this is the particularly important part, the rights and dignity of all residents are maintained and protected. And that's really the framework for how the government in Washington operates. And so we were interested in understanding, number one, what does it mean to be a welcoming state, and how well is this are we doing and implementing the kinds of programs necessary to make sure that we really are welcoming of immigrants. The scope of the study was, in some respects, very broad. We look at the foreign-born population regardless of immigration status. So what we mean by that is that amongst the foreign-born in Washington are naturalized citizens, legal permanent residents who have the right to apply at some point to become citizens. But we also have people who are here without authorization from the government, or people who have very temporary statuses and may eventually stay permanently in the U.S., but there's no guarantee for that. And we're looking at all of these. And we looked at both the contributions and the barriers faced by immigrants, but also by the communities in which they're residing, just to make sure that we were looking at the positives and also negatives to the extent that those were ones that we could do something about. And so we looked at four major areas: the economic opportunities for immigrants and what they're doing in terms of their economic activities, their access to language, to English language programs, but also to translation and interpretation when they needed it. Social inclusion, which included both the various things that immigrants were exposed to in the state, but also their use of public programs. And then we did something that's not usually done in these studies, but we looked at the role of local leagues and sent out a survey, got very, very good answers to them. And that helped us understand not only what we might do in terms of a position on immigrant integration, but also what role the local leagues can be playing. Next. Our sources of data included a fairly wide variety of both quantitative data and qualitative data. Most of the quantitative data came from census. The census, either we did it ourselves and looked at and analyzed the results, or we used reports and studies that had was using census data and that focused on Washington state. We did a deep dive in state legislation and regulation so that we'd understand what currently exists as a starting point for looking at where the gaps might be or where there might be implementation problems. We interviewed stakeholders and we had discussions with immigrants, and sometimes those were one and the same. So we made a a real effort to talk with people in immigrant-led organizations or refugee-led organizations in order to get their perspective and not just make assumptions of our own or even use the academic literature, but really talk to the people most effective. And then we did the survey of local leagues. Next. So oh, I'm doing this one still. So let me give you a little bit more information about who the immigrants in Washington State are. About 15% of our residents are foreign born. And about 14% are US citizens with at least one immigrant family. So that brings us up to about 25% of the total population of the state are either immigrants themselves or are the children of immigrants. Most of the immigrants in Washington State have legal status, but about 25% are undocumented or they have temporary protection to remain. They're not on a pathway to citizenship. And about half of all of the foreign born in the country are naturalized citizens. So we have a fairly large number of people who are here permanently and involved in our civics or in other activities in the state. So Lydia, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm Lydia Zapata, and I wanted to talk about more information from our study and how Washington State has been a leader in policies welcoming immigrants. We are focused particularly on the policies of the state because we're developing a state position on immigrants. So you may not know this, but Washington State is one of the few states that provides driver's licenses to all immigrants, regardless of their status. They provide in-state tuition to immigrants regardless of their status. We have a very important piece of legislation called Keep Washington Working. The Keep Washington Working Act basically prohibits peace officers, sheriffs and police, from cooperating with immigration unless there's a court order signed by a judge. Many other states do not have this. We also provide professional licenses and certifications for immigrants, regardless of their immigration status. This has been very helpful in many key areas of employment within our state. And we also provide health insurance on the exchange to immigrants, regardless of their status. This is not very common in other states. And we have limited numbers of adults who can get Apple Health or Apple Care, which is the Medicaid version, state version of Medicaid. We do also provide Medicaid through Apple Health to all children under the age of 18, also unusual for most states. We have very strong state policies and local government policies regarding multilingual instruction. And we don't necessarily have the funds in many school districts to implement some of these policies, but we have a good framework. But one of the things that we wanted to highlight from the study is that while we have many laws and policies, some may not always be implemented, and sometimes that's because of will, and sometimes that's because of budget. One of the things that we talk about in the study is how important the legal framework is for immigrants. Lacking secure legal status really impedes integration because it can result in family separation. Many immigrant families have mixed status. Somebody in the family may have one type of status, someone else in the family may have a different type of status. This can lead to the potential for family separation and certainly fear of detention and fear of deportation. Another aspect of the legal system is that because immigration law is a civil issue, there's a cost to applying, and sometimes immigrants don't have that. There's also a cost to legal representation, which is essential in most cases to achieve secure status or even to naturalize. But there's no free right of representation. So you have to pay out of pocket or find an organization that will provide pro bono representation. Another aspect, which we have reminded today, is how important our Attorney General has been in litigating against federal policies that harm Washington immigrants. Our prior Attorney General was very instrumental in overturning the Muslim ban. Our current Attorney General has successfully challenged the ban on birthright citizenship, although we may see that being taken to higher courts. Our study also covers the economic contributions of immigrants. And what's really important to remember is that immigrants, regardless of their status, are paying federal, state, and local taxes. And in Washington state, they paid over $20 billion in taxes last year. Another thing to be mindful of is that immigrants are entrepreneurial and creative. They're much more likely than native-born residents to start businesses. While immigrants only make up 15% of the population, they make up 20% of the business owners in the state and generate about $3 billion worth of business income a year in the state. In addition, immigrants are more likely to have patents and more likely to be Nobel Prize winners. Notably, 1/3 of the Nobel Prize winners in the past decade were immigrants to the United States. Another economic contribution is their contribution in employment. Like we said before, 15% of the population in Washington are immigrants, but 20%, 1 in 5, are workers in Washington state. They're a very important part of our economy. They're crucial in many industries, particularly high tech, where about 51% of all software engineers are immigrants. In agriculture, where 77% of the agricultural workers are immigrants. And things like construction, hospitality, and healthcare. In the hospitality area, about half of the workers are immigrants. And in health aides, in healthcare, over 1/3 of the workers are immigrants. So they're crucial in many industries, but sometimes the conditions of their employment are particularly problematic because of immigration. Immigrants want to work, but sometimes there's delays in work authorization. If they are asylum seekers or refugees, it may take some time in order for them to get authorized to work. That causes burdens on their families as well as social services. Those delays can be from weeks to months to a year. In addition, sometimes immigrants are working in industries that have dangerous conditions at work sites that are particularly problematic because there's immigrants who may be afraid to report those conditions. And in addition, depending on the status of immigrants, at the high end, they may have contracts or a particular type of visa, which only lasts for a couple years, or they may be in low wage positions where the visas may last just months. So there's some instability in their workforce. So we also looked at language access and acquisition because these are crucial, obviously, to both accessing services as well as becoming part of civic life in our state. We have very strong English as a second language or ESL programs for school children. And there are programs for adults that are public, but they're also private ESL programs. The issue with adults is that there's far more demand by immigrant adults for ESL courses than there are places for them. So there needs to be more ESL available for adults. There also is, while there are state and local government efforts that either designate or make attempt to have adequate interpretation and translation services, sometimes budgets don't necessarily allow this, and that can cause problems. So obviously having interpretation and translation services is really important for immigrants to be able to access services in their state and local government. In looking at social inclusion of immigrants, we heard back from all of the immigrants that we interviewed that they had experienced xenophobia and anti-immigrant rhetoric. Sometimes that looked like people yelling at them as they're driving by or walking down the street. Sometimes it was discrimination in their jobs or in housing. They expressed concerns, personal safety concerns about not feeling safe, but also about their children. And particularly, we're concerned about bullying in schools because their kids may speak a different language, have an accent, look different. And so those concerns were raised. In addition to that, there was a lot of concern about access to healthcare. In some cases, despite the fact that all immigrants have access to the exchange, they may not be able to afford it given given their jobs. And if they don't have, if they're not a permanent resident or a naturalized citizen, they may not be able to have access to health insurance through their employment. And so they may not be qualified for because there aren't enough places in the Apple Health or Medicaid within the state. So having they may not have access to healthcare, but also the issue is one of having healthcare in a language and that people understand and delivered in a way that is culturally appropriate. This is even more important in mental health services. There's a complete lack of adequate mental health services for immigrants. Finding therapists who actually speak another language or at least are willing to work with interpreters is hard enough, but then finding interpreters who may actually have some cultural competency working with the issues that many of these immigrants have. You have to remember that many people are coming to this country because they've experienced severe trauma in their home countries. Immigrants, like everyone else in Washington state, are having difficulties finding affordable housing, but language and culture may impose and status may have some even greater impediments to being able to find affordable housing. If you don't have the language, if you don't know how things work, it can make it that much harder to find affordable housing. In terms of civic engagement, we heard a lot about the very high cost of becoming naturalized and the time it takes to follow all the rules, but it still takes a long time to become naturalized. You have to pass tests. It costs a lot of money. You may need a lawyer. And so there's those kinds of barriers. But then also, even once you become naturalized, there may be barriers in just participating in our government because you may not understand how our elections work. You may not understand the ballots. You may need to have the ballots translated, and our state does translate ballots. And I believe Spokane also translates ballots in additional languages that the state does not cover. But immigrants may not vote simply because they don't understand what the issues are, or they don't understand the form of government. So they don't feel confident in voting. Fortunately, there's organizations like the League of Women Voters who can assist people with those issues. Other barriers that might occur in terms of civic engagement are fear and distrust of government institutions. Remember that many people are coming from countries where they don't trust their government, or they're absolutely afraid of their government. So learning to trust their government is something that maybe not come naturally. The lack of interpretation and translation may also be an impediment to civic engagement. If you go to your local city council, do they actually have city council meetings in? Do they translate? Most of them don't even have ASL. And then immigrants having experienced disrespect may feel really reluctant to engage in public life because of that bad experience that they've had with xenophobia. Overall, there is a lack of civics and education programs that are directed to immigrants, and a lack of outreach by civics organizations to immigrants. So we're going to take a little pause here, and maybe I should pull this, stop this so we can see people and just see if there's any questions, and if people could raise their hand.
Susan, there's a comment, Lydia, there's a comment in the chat you might want to address.
I'm trying to reach the chat because I can't look at the chat and the screen. Okay, so in the chat you will find the study link, and it's available, and where you can purchase it in the Kindle. Yeah, English language.
Yeah, that one.
English language learners rather than ESL. Yes, that sorry about that. Many immigrants are learning English as a third or even a fourth language, yes, or fifth. Yes. Yes, ESL is probably not correct. They're learning many languages. But there aren't any questions, concerns, comments? I can't see any hands. Do you see any hands? Susan, if you're talking, you're muted.
There are no hands raised.
Okay, well, we will move on then. Let me share the screen again, and I'll turn it back over to Susan.
Well, we have one compliment in the chat. Thank you. That appreciate your sentiment that we've done a good job. Okay, so one of the reasons for the webinar, obviously, is to help prepare everybody for the consensus meetings, to see what the questions are and why we're asking them, but also the process and facilitation of the consensus meetings. So I'll start talking about the questions, and then Lydia is going to talk more about the process. So we have a number of discussion questions that the league can use to pave the way for the consensus questions. So to get people going in talking about immigration issues. And they involve things like just, having read the book, the report, how well do you think that Washington welcomes immigrants? What are the contributions of immigrants? What are the challenges faced by immigrants? And how can these be addressed? What are the costs and challenges faced by the communities in which immigrants reside, and how can these be addressed? And then, importantly, we'll come back on the consensus questions with this. Do you think local leagues should be doing more to engage in the integration of immigrants? And if so, what? And we'll come back to that issue. We suggest that you not spend much time, though, on these general issues, because it will take a lot of time to answer the consensus questions. And clearly people, given what's happening today, the newspapers they're reading are going to want to talk about immigration. And it'll be important to make sure that this focuses on what the state is doing and the state can be doing. So our first consensus question is about the set of questions are about the protection of immigrant rights. Should the league have a strong position condemning xenophobia, discrimination, and anti-immigration rhetoric? And then if so, should we encourage political leaders in Washington to take actions to counter these threats to democracy? And so we want to start with what we think is, the most difficult in some respects to deal with, but also pretty clear cut in terms of, we're assuming that there are few in the league that would agree that we shouldn't condemn xenophobia, discrimination, and anti-immigrant rhetoric. Then should the league call on the state of Washington to continue to oppose federal policies when these policies are undermining the rights of immigrants, and potentially as with the birthright citizenship, the rights of their children born in the United States. So do we think it's a good idea for the state to continue to go out of its way to oppose these federal policies? And then should we support state funding to ensure greater access to legal representation for immigrants, and prepare the road for getting to that situation? A number of cities already do it, but it's not universal across the state. Next slide. Then the second set of consensus questions are about access to essential services in Washington, those that are really needed in order for people to have healthy lives and be able to have the opportunities that they may be able to use. So should we base the advocacy on the proposition that state and local governments are accountable for providing essential services to all refugees, regardless of immigration status? So that their list of certain ones which we talk about in the report that should be available to everyone because they're a person, a human being, not because of their immigration status. And then should we be supporting holistic approaches to welcoming immigrants that take into account the interconnected challenges that immigrants face? And these are challenges of their status, of the lack of language capability, and despite a real desire to have English language opportunities. And then do we need to have more effective coordination among state agencies that interact with migrants and refugees? In fact, the legislature passed a bill on that, and then it didn't fund it. And so there's legislation authorizing this type of coordination, but it's hard to implement it without some funding. And so the funding issue is essential as well. Next slide. Okay, continuing on this theme, should we be supporting safe working conditions, fair pay, and benefits for immigrants, again, regardless of immigration status? Washington has some very good laws in general about worker rights and working conditions, but not all of them apply to immigrants. And many immigrants are afraid to report problems in the workforce because of their legal status. So there are things that perhaps we could be doing a better job on. And then should we support efforts taken by state government and immigrant-led organizations to reduce delays in the issuance of work permits? Our people we interviewed had a number of suggestions that we should look at as possible ways of helping immigrants to be able to work once they get here. Next slide. And then the role of the local leagues in welcoming immigrants. And should we be agreeing that the leagues should reach out proactively to immigrants and naturalized citizens to learn more about their needs and the contributions they may make. And the next slide has some suggestions about things that local leagues are already doing in some cases, but others might want to add. And I won't read through all of them, but they're part of our discussion of this is a consensus. And it's how proactive to be, and partnerships with immigrant-led organizations, helping naturalization, focusing on civics education. A lot of that's happening already, but not everywhere. And the various other things that you could see on the slide. I think there's some questions that are already popping up in the chat, and we'll come back to those after we go through the rest of these slides. So I think you're up next, Lydia.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the consensus process and the fact that all members are invited to participate in the consensus, and that members should review the study and consensus questions prior to the meeting. That consensus by members is reached after study and discussion. It's not a simple majority, and it does not require unanimity. It's just the overall sense of the group as expressed through discussion. It's not a vote or a poll, but you can use a show of hands just to get a sense of what group opinion is. So the meeting facilitator in the consensus should guide the discussion. So you need to pick a meeting facilitator, and note takers should be assigned to take detailed notes during the consensus process, because the consensus questions are not just answering the questions, but also providing comments, so that the state league can develop a single response based on what each local league submits. There's many ways to structure the meeting, but discussion is required. So no simple polls by email. You can do it in person, you can use Zoom, you can do a hybrid meeting, you can pre-assign specific questions, you can delegate to a specific committee to hold the meeting. But you just have to make sure that you have discussion. So obviously you have to invite all your members. You have to remind members that they must review the study and consensus questions before the meeting to participate. You should assign a consensus facilitator ahead of time. And we suggest setting no more than making sure that it's less than a 2-hour meeting. You can make it shorter if you like, but we suggest no more than 2 hours. And inform folks ahead of time what the time frame is so that they will not be surprised. Assign at least one note taker who is not the facilitator, because the facilitator is not able to take notes. That's just too difficult to do at the same time. And then agree on a process to reach consensus. Oftentimes that may just simply be the facilitator making sure that everyone agrees with the process that they're putting forth. And if you want one of us from the study to be available for your consensus meeting, please contact us. We will do our very best to be available for your meeting. During the meeting, explain the consensus process and the purpose of the meeting, and remind your members this is a state study addressing state and local policies, programs, and actions. It does not address federal policies. Emphasize that what we're trying to do here is develop a state league policy on immigrants that will be based on the responses that the local leagues give to the consensus questions. And you're encouraged to redirect conversation to state policies if you need to. You might need to cut people off because they might go down roads that are very important, but don't deal with the consensus. And you really want to get all of those consensus questions answered. Just some tips that we all know about: start meetings on time, end on time, or early. The discussion questions, as we mentioned, are optional. We recommend allocating no more than 10 minutes to maybe one discussion question, and answer all of the consensus questions, noting whether there's agreement or not, and noting any comments. This is where the note takers are really important. The notes that are provided under each consensus question provide some context. So the facilitator may wish to actually read those and highlight those notes. So I think, and then if you need to contact either Susan or myself, these are our emails. I will stop sharing and maybe I'll put those in the chat so that we can see everybody and see what the questions are.
Okay, maybe we can start with some of the ones that are in the chat. If they're please explain the well, let me see. The first one was completely new to the LWV study. This is Clara. Did you want me to read it, or would you like to read it? You have stated yourself.
You are fine to read it. I think you could read it fine. And if you need clarification, I'm happy to add.
Okay, so do you have any explanations as to how you decide what few pages to reference with respect to each consensus question statement? Okay, we have each consensus question comes with a note that explains what the issue is about on that, and then we chose the places. It was basically just by doing a keyword search of the report to be able to show where that these were areas where we had specific reference to the issues that are under discussion in that consensus statement. That helps.
Yeah, but I'm going to assume sometimes it's just a couple pages, and so that doesn't necessarily mean that one doesn't need to sort of really look at much more of the document to understand how to, right? I mean, that's
exactly.
understood.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's understood that people are to read the entire document, and certainly the part that are not appendices, which is the shorter one. But then, if you want to review in your mind, okay, what does this mean? These are things you can look at. On that. What we mean by holistic approaches on that, when we talk about the need for those that way, is that there's an interconnection amongst a lot of the challenges that immigrants face. So if the housing issue Lydia was mentioning can't be dealt with on its own if you don't also do what are the sources of income for people, how far it's the affordable housing from where they potentially can get jobs and things of that sort. So, or are they still traumatized by having been tortured in their home country? Is that affecting whether they can get jobs? So it's to look at them as a whole human being, and what are the various different needs and issues they have. And what we try to do throughout the report is to recognize that citizens who are not naturalized, birthright citizens, experience many of the same issues and problems. So we try to understand what are the extra problems that immigrants face beyond what others do. And it's not to say that they deserve more or less attention, but rather that they may need different attention as a result of their experiences in the situation that they're in.
They may need interpretation or
sure.
language.
Yeah.
How large do you think the discussion group should be? If we're so you could, if you're talking just about the discussion questions and not the consensus questions, one approach might be to just have little breakout groups and just have, anywhere from 3 to 5 people discuss each discussion question. And then if you have time, they could report back. If you're talking about the consensus questions, that should be the whole group. Annette, does that answer your question?
Well, no, actually not. That was my question. Of course, I would hope that we have 30 or 40 of our people who are interested in coming. Maybe I'm being overly optimistic. But our idea was that we would break that into smaller groups. We want to do a hybrid meeting. So we will have people in the room who naturally will make one discussion group with one facilitator. People who are on Zoom who may be one or more groups. So that's what I'm asking. What are the size of those groups that you think is maximum?
Well, it depends on your ability to do that. I mean, how many facilitators do you have? But you do have to bring them back together and have a discussion of the consensus questions together.
Yes,
Yeah.
we
So
would. That
they
was
have
our
to
hope
report
that
back.
we would
Yeah,
have a response from 3 or 4 groups, and then have a time that we would all convene together and be able to discuss if there was great difference between the different groups. This is sort of the way it worked with the elder care study that we did
Right.
recently.
yeah. Judy, you have your hand up. Is it to address this issue?
Yes,
Yeah, go ahead.
I think if people are on Zoom, you have to have smaller groups to discuss anything. I've been in different little breakout rooms on Zoom, and you don't have a lot of time for that discussion, but it's not the same as being in a room where you might be able to turn to your neighbor. So I would suggest if you could have them as small as 4 to 6, I mean 6 maximum,
Mm,
if you're doing it on Zoom, because
Thank you.
that gives everyone in the group a chance to say something.
And the other thing you may want to consider is to divide up the questions amongst the groups so that each is addressing a different question, and then come back and talk about it so that you're not spending so much time on the discussion that it becomes hard to answer the questions.
Really. Yeah, I think there will be some people who'd be very disappointed they couldn't chime in on
On
number
everything.
5.
No, I'm not. I'm talking about the discussion ahead of the consensus
I'm
questions.
just,
Yeah,
yeah, my reference
Yeah.
is only about the consensus questions, not the discussion.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah, no, if you're talking about the consensus questions, then everybody should address all of them. Yes. In each
Thank
of
you.
those groups. Elaine, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Well, maybe you just clarified. I was confused about it. It sounds to me like for the discussion groups, you can have smaller groups taking place for the discussion questions. But for consensus, all of the people in the room and all of the people online, if it's hybrid, they have to have one conversation. You cannot have a consensus question hybrid meeting and a consensus question in-person meeting. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question from Elaine about consensus questions are written as statements the League of Women Voters should, and that's because we're trying to develop a position for the state league, is my understanding, right?
Yes. Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And we went through a lot of different ways in which consensus questions have been posed, and some of those who reviewed our initial draft also recommended this as being an easier way to move from this discussion into developing the position.
Meg, you have your hand up.
Yeah, there I am. Hi, thank you. I have a question about the study. I haven't read it, the whole thing. I live in the Highline School District, which has a large amount of ELL students and immigrants, and it is very taxing on the school district. And with the strong equity movement, we have we're families who want traditional education, who want to get their kids competitive for the UW, that type of thing, are really struggling with this issue. And a lot of them are quite angry, I have to say, about it because resources are going away from, as they see it, their child into funding these the issues that these students bring in. One of the big examples is the translation, huge amounts of resources to try to get the translation services. So I was wondering if your group discussed this and how to make this issue more equitable across the state. So our district has more resources to manage this versus districts that don't have this issue as much, that kind of thing. It's a lot of the reason people vote the way they do. They're angry. So I'm not one of those, but I just know that this is what's going on in our district. And I was wondering if you all discussed this inequity,
We
that
did,
it's
and
heavier in some areas and not in others.
we did discuss that. That came up through our interviews that not all the school districts have the same resources, and many school districts have a lot more programs, a lot more opportunities for students, whether they are immigrants or not. But one of the things that we would like to highlight is that you can also look at the immigrant children in your school district as incredible resources, because they speak other languages and would allow a really vibrant dual language program to be developed in the school district. Problem is most school districts don't have the funds to do that.
We do
But
have a dual
the
language
idea,
programs. We're in the lowest quartile performance in the state of Washington. And it
right?
has
If you,
dropped
excuse me,
significantly. So
Meg,
we don't
Meg,
see it helping. Okay. I'm just trying, I need some help from you guys to how to sell this to people who are angry.
well, if you would let me finish.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So my point is that the dual language programs can provide a skill that is not available currently in most school districts in a workforce where being monolingual is no longer going to be acceptable in many businesses, where people are going to have the ability to speak multiple languages. So that's one way to sell it. Another way of thinking about it is, do you really, really want to take resources away from children, and make sure that, that not all children in your district have access to learning, period? I mean, it's really an issue of, do you value all children having access to education? That would be my
Okay.
response. But Susan, you may have another one.
Well, I think Janet had her hand up, and Judy, I would just want to get other members of our study committee into this. If it's on this issue, Janet or Judy, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Janet Leonard. I was on the committee. So I think this is a great example, Meg, of where comments, there's a section for comments under each consensus question. So it could be that a group comes to a consensus that they'd like to support the concept of supporting children who are learning English, but you could put in your comment something about funds should, because we're talking about state funds should be distributed based on populations in need, et cetera, in a manner that doesn't undermine school funding for all programs. So please use the comment section to modify and explain your group's issues.
Judy, did you want to add something?
Probably shouldn't. There, my information about school districts is not as up to date as it should be. I have served as a school board member in the past, so I know about funding as special programs for special need children, whether they're immigrants or other categories. Many times that funding is not adequate. It's usually not taken away from other students. It's added to the program. The funding of the school district, it would be helpful probably if a local school district could kind of explain that how it's distributed, how they receive funds for these programs to the community, because that might be a good education program within your community, is to deal with that kind of issue and use that as an example of education for your community, because we don't all understand it, and maybe there's something that we can all learn from that. Maybe a school district can learn something from it too.
Yeah, yeah. Your question was, very much something that we debated over the time in terms of, how we dealt with the impacts on locations, and on the education issue, we did some intensive interviewing of people at the state level who were dealing with education, and then also in Spokane and San Juan County. We wanted to get a little bit of a viewpoint from different places in terms of the size of the education programs and the number of immigrants who were in them and on it. And one of the things that did come up was exactly the point that you raised, that there is inequitable funding across the state. And it's not necessarily related to the number of immigrant children who were there. And that's part of what we were trying to get at in our study of understanding where there are gaps within a structure that otherwise is really well thought through, which would be the case with the dual and multi-language programs. But as same way, it's great that the state legislature is pushing for better coordinated programs. But if you don't put money into things, unfortunately, this is a bad year for talking about that issue because of the budget problems in the state. But over the long term, I think the study brings us to a point where we're really looking for equitable responses that mean that certain communities aren't overwhelmed by when others are getting as much funding as they need to deal with these issues.
Mary Lynn and then Shenandoah.
It seems to me that part of the difficulty is the league positions. Are league positions aspirational, or are they closer to a plan of action that's going to be implemented in a year or two? And I think that's where some of the confusion comes in, and people see the positions differently, and so therefore answer the consensus questions differently.
Yeah, I mean, my sense, and please others on the committee jump in on this, but my sense is that the consensus, the positions are a mix of aspirational and what can be done in the next few years. But they provide, I mean, some of the league positions on different issues are, 20, 30 years old at this point, but they were drafted in a way that still has meaning on issues. And I think that's where we want to go, so that we're not just dealing with today's problem, but we're trying to deal with what may become problems over a longer term period, or opportunities over a longer term period.
And I think some clarification of that as people begin to discuss this could be helpful. It might produce a better consensus.
Well, in terms of all of the league positions, they are all fairly general because the purpose of them is to provide a framework for supporting policies, because we cannot always anticipate what policies or what legislation will be considered And so the idea is to provide a framework for guiding the type of advocacy that we can do as a league. We don't want to make it overly constraining or specific, because then we box ourselves in, right?
Yeah.
Because what we're trying to do is provide a way to advocate for policy and legislation.
Jen and Jeva?
Hi there, thank you. First, I want to say I'm incredibly impressed with how thorough and thoughtful this report is. I'm just in awe of what you ladies have done. I wanted to ask, we're talking about funding for schools. However, and there being this shortage, but it's also kind of, to me, it feels like a cultural issue in our society because, Mount Vernon has got immersion programs. Why do they have the funds for immersion programs? I think it's a choice that they made to put funds towards those immersion programs where I don't know where else other than Eastern Washington, I think. I don't know that anywhere else in Western Washington has the immersion programs. And then that also goes back to what I think I was understanding of somebody saying that people are angry. And I'm not sure which side that was on, who's angry. Is it the immigrants that are angry or the people who are angry at the immigrants for taking funds or resources away from, that's what our society, that's what our culture is presenting right now, is that the immigrants are taking away from US citizens. So is that, and I liked what you just said about the league's position and how that gets presented, because I think you need to envelop everybody by making sure that it's not overwhelming in specific positions, I guess. Maybe that's not making sense, but anyway, so the schools and why do some schools utilize those funds, and then the cultural issues and what exactly, I wasn't quite clear as to what the anger was. Where was that anger coming from? Somebody kept asking about, what do I tell people who are angry about this? So those are my two questions.
Meg?
Meg, do you want to answer that?
Yeah. Going back to the Highline School District, we do have a dual language program, and unfortunately, our academic outcomes has gotten worse with it, not better. My three kids all graduated speaking 2 languages, so I'm all behind it. I'm all for it, but that was a choice. Now it's much different now, the way they're integrating it. Anyway, the anger is coming from many families want to put their kids into school so that they be competitive for the UW, for competitive colleges, but the resources are going to helping the population of students that we have a lot of. We have like 120 different languages. We have a lot of new immigrants here. I don't want to sound like I'm opposed to this. I'm not opposed to it. My question I'm asking is, some districts are struggling a lot more with this than others, and I just want to understand that people that come from districts that are not struggling with this understand what it means to live in a district that is. I mean, and I guess I'm trying to get some clarity if people understand what you're trying to do, that it's harder in some areas of the state than in other areas of the state.
Yeah.
And the anger is coming from the lower academic outcomes that is happening in Highline. We're now in the lowest quartile of performance in the state of Washington. We never used to be. And we have, Chris Reichdahl is out saying, we need more math. We need more math. We don't, our kids aren't getting the jobs. And he's right. And because we're putting all these resources into these other things. And so that's what people are angry about. I don't want to say I'm angry about it, but the people that I live with in my community are. And I just want to know if this study addresses that.
Well, it doesn't address, I mean, basically the issue, I think, isn't so much what resources are being spent, but it's the large number of people who, of kids now who are in the school systems that are not fluent in English and need help in order to get there. One of the things we want to be very clear about is that this study isn't, and the position is not about what we do about immigration, about who comes in and how they come in and what their status is on it. It's really taking a more of a stance of for those who are here and after their entry, how do we ensure that they, and who are likely to stay in the country and probably stay in the state, how do we help ensure that they can be integrated into our societies in the best way possible on that? So we're not trying to tackle, federal, U.S. immigration policy. I did that for most of my career. And I can tell you it's very complex and we don't want to get into that. But once people are, kids, and particularly kids are here, what can we do best? And if it turns out that these multilingual programs are not doing what were thought to be done, then there should be a review of them to see what's bad, what didn't work on it, in order to be able to see, what are the factors that cause the problem.
May I say something else? It's Shenandoah.
Sure.
So addressing this issue, I think all of the issues that you're trying to address for those immigrants that live here and the needs of those immigrants will ultimately trickle down to the children and increase their abilities to be successful, right? Which will in turn change the outcome of what's happening in the schools and the test scores. The things that the parents are experiencing right now are dreadful. And if we can help them navigate our systems and make their families that much more successful overall, it'll help everything.
Thank you. Terry, you have your hand up.
Yes, I was also on the study committee, and I just want to address Meg. One of our interviews was with the two women who are with the Office of, I always forget the initials.
Superintendent for Public Instruction.
Thank
Right.
you. And they are the two women in charge of multilingual and migrant education. And in that interview, they were very clear that there are school districts that are overpopulated by need and school districts that don't have any people, and that was quite a problem. And I think maybe consulting with them would be a great way to have some input on how to present what's being done at the state level to try to address that. They were both very passionate about education, and I think they are very aware of the problem you're bringing up.
And it is fundamentally a problem of the way we fund our schools and the fact that we don't fully fund our schools, and we fund them according to, the property taxes in our local area. So this is fundamentally a problem with our educational funding.
Hey, other questions before we we break. Chinda, is your hand up still from the last one, or did you have another?
Oh, yeah, sorry. I'll
Okay,
take it
no,
down.
that's fine. I just wanted to make sure that you didn't want to say something else. So I need thank you, and thank you so much for these very, very good comments people made, and Nick, thank you particularly because it's hard to go out on a limb and talk about these issues in what's a very realistic way, but sometimes a difficult way of talking about it. So really appreciate your openness on that. And please do let us know if you would like somebody from the study committee to come to your meetings, and let us know so we can in enough time so that we can make sure that we can find some if one of us has the schedule for it.
Marissa has a question.
Oh, Marissa.
Yes, it takes just a minute before we leave. As a Mexican immigrant, I will let you know that this discussion is very important. And part of this study, Betty, is not accurate right now, but for that situation that everybody knows. But believe me, every opinion, any idea that you give is not a bad opinion, is not a bad idea. Because all of these questions, because I read a lot of the study, are very important for me as an immigrant. And I think about not just from my community, Mexican community, I thinking about refugees, about people who came with work visa. This is about all immigrants. So that's my only thing that I want to ask you. Please don't think just in undocumented people, because the situation right now is about the whole immigrant community that came here in different ways, right? The people who don't need any ASL because they come to a private school because they have a really good job, but also they need to feel welcoming in our state. The people who came from the home country with any sense of educations, even though no reading, no writing, nothing about. So how we can welcome those in our community, because now they are part of this community. So I just want to say that, and once again, thank you to all of you, because this is very, very important as an immigrant to hear all your ideas and perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Janet, did you
I notice in the chat there's two questions we have not answered. One is, please explain the meaning of holistic approaches.
We did discuss that.
And why are the statements written as the league should?
Okay, we covered that one also.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So if there are no more questions, why don't we adjourn? And again, keep us in mind, and thank you so much for participating in this. And I'm sure Karen, who's I see on the screen, who's going through the elder care process now, is I don't know if there's something you want to say because you've had the experience.
No, I think it was a great presentation. It's a great report. And I think it was prescient that you did it when you did it. I'm so glad that I mean, this started 2 years ago, and who would have thought that how much it's needed right now?
Yeah, how timely.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was really pleased that the state board agreed that 2 years ago that this was an issue that we needed to address. So anyway, I will call an end to the meeting then, and I hope to see you at your consensus meetings.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
Thank you.